Hello, my name is Eric Nelson. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of the National Nordic Museum here in Seattle, and I want to welcome you to the panel discussion, the U.S. and Nordics 2021. Several people to thank. First, I'd like to thank our partners in this presentation, the University of Washington Scandinavian Studies Department. Secondly, I'd like to thank our moderator, Jay Bruns, who's a member of the National Nordic Museum's Board of Trustees, as well as the Board of Advisors to the Scandinavian Studies Department at University of Washington. Finally, I'd like to thank the museum's Board of Trustees who stepped up financially to make this program available to all of us. Thank you. That said, we've got a short video discussing the museum, and then we'll turn it over to Andy from University of Washington, who will introduce our moderator and our speakers. Thank you very much.
Every single person I meet and talk about this museum has the same experience. They walk in and there's a moment of awe. And you know there is an adventure ahead of you.
And we're thrilled with how successful the grand opening was.
And as it represents some of the happiest countries in the world, may it also be a source of great happiness for all who visit. Thank you.
I think members in the entire community have been overwhelmed with the transformation of the Nordic Museum into a world-class institution. The mission of the museum is to share Nordic culture with a broad audience, and we do that through exhibitions, programs, and collections. We also serve as a community gathering place.
It's so solidly grounded in the Nordic values.
We've used 4 values: openness, social justice, connection to nature, and innovation, to look at 12,000 years of Nordic history.
And it's earned its top spot amongst the world's best museums because of that. It's a journey. The layers of stories are so interesting that it depends on my mood what I can walk away with and how I experience it. One day, I'm connecting to the story of the immigrants. One day, I'm walking through an exhibition. Another day, I have a moment of meditation, watching beautiful scenic pictures.
One of the purposes is to share culture, share artifacts, share evidence of past life in the Nordic countries, but another one is what's going on currently. And there has been quite a bit of interest in the United States in the Nordic model, so to speak.
And I don't think of it as a museum and sort of the stodgy, you come look at static exhibitions. This is a place of learning. I think of this just as an open place to really have dialogue around arts and culture, but also about important policy issues that face all of us.
The Nordic Museum that we have here is not like a regular museum. I think it's a community builder.
Museums is not only about the past, it's also about, I think, the future, and I think particularly putting together the past and the future is actually a pretty exciting idea. And of course, the museum itself, these facilities here are fantastic.
My enthusiasm and passion has only grown with this new museum. It just fills my soul to come here every time and give a tour and share its beauty and its history. Anyone who is not a member yet of this museum and who has not yet seen it are missing out greatly.
When I leave the National Nordic Museum, I'm filled with optimism. This place is very special.
We built this museum to honor our forebears, our parents and our grandparents, and we did it to inspire the next generation, our children and our grandchildren.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'm Andy Nestigan, Chair of the Department of Scandinavian Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington. We're so proud of our connections throughout the region, and especially of our partnership with the National Nordic Museum. As a university and department, we seek to make an impact that stretches beyond our state through global partnerships. Through the College of Arts and Sciences, the UW's largest academic unit, we offer myriad opportunities to study and research the natural and human world, politics and institutions, literature and culture, including some 60 languages, among them the Nordic and Baltic languages. The Department of Scandinavian Studies is the largest of its kind in North America, with faculty spanning the Nordic and Baltic countries and several academic disciplines. More than ever, we need to become more knowledgeable about each other, even as the relationship between the United States and the Nordic countries goes back centuries. What's happened to that relationship in recent years? How do we see each other? What can we do to strengthen our relationship in the years to come? As a leading public university in partnership with a leading national museum, we welcome and encourage conversation about important local, national, and global issues, like today's panel. It is my pleasure to thank the National Nordic Museum for the partnership, an anonymous supporter of the department and museum for the generosity that made today's event possible, and the brilliant panelists for their contribution. Not least, I thank my colleague, Mr. Jay Bruns, for serving as moderator. I turn it over to you, Jay, and look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Andy. I'm Jay Bruns, and I'm delighted to moderate today's panel. By way of introduction, I'm a board member of the museum and an advisory board member for the Scandinavian Studies Department at the University of Washington, today's program's co-sponsors. I've lived in 2 Nordic countries for a combined total of 6 years, including as U.S. acting ambassador in Norway. As you can see from their biographies, all 5 panelists are leaders in their respective societies with backgrounds in journalism, government, culture, and business. Each also has a strong understanding of the United States. We will look to them to offer you, the audience, what the attitudes are in their home country toward the United States. We'll hear their ideas on why their attitudes are what they are, and we hope to get their thoughts on what it will take to improve these attitudes going forward. This seems especially pertinent as the US political leadership is in the process of transition. I think all on this call will agree that historically, the US and the Nordics, which are Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland, have enjoyed a strong and deep and mutually beneficial relationship. But current attitudes are troubling. One indicator is the results of a survey that the Pew Research Center has been conducting for decades. It annually tracks the reputation of the US in some 30 allied and friendly countries, including 2 Nordics. The title of the press release from the Pew Research Center announcing this year's results says it all. The US image plummets internationally. Before turning to the panel, I thought it would be useful to give an overview of the Nordic region. All 5 Nordic countries boast a combined population of 27 million. This translates into less than 0.4% of the world's population. However, the Nordics play an outsized role internationally, despite modest numbers. All 5 countries routinely are at the top of the rankings for the world's wealthiest countries in per capita terms, as well as the most technologically advanced. And they have come a long way rapidly. For example, Norway was said to have been the poorest nation in Western Europe at the end of World War II. The Nordic countries also wind up at the top of the rankings of the most open and free economies. Some receive rankings on these annual lists above the United States, for example. So they're therefore not socialist economies as sometimes incorrectly described. They do, of course, have public healthcare systems along their private options for those who wish, and other social programs are more generous than in most places of the world, including the United States. Also, they are generally considered to have the least income inequality and the lowest corruption. The Nordic democracies have a reputation for being among the strongest and most inclusive. Currently, for example, the prime ministers of 4 of the 5 countries are women. The Nordic countries collaborate and they help advance the status of post-war institutions that the United States helped create. 3 are members of our military alliance, NATO, and the current Secretary General of NATO is from the region. The same Nordic engagement goes for the United Nations. Of the 9 Secretaries General of the United Nations since its founding in 1946, 2 are from the Nordics. The current and immediate past heads of the UN Environment Program are as well. The Nordics also punch above their weight in the scientific and moral realms. Consider the annual Nobel Prizes, including the Peace Prize, which are decided in this region. Finally, Nordic immigration to the US has influenced our own country. This influence continues to this day. For example, the current CEO of Verizon is from Sweden. And here in Seattle, the leadership ranks of companies like Microsoft, Boeing, and T-Mobile are replete with recent immigrants from the Nordic region. And now to the panel. We're going to proceed from east to west, starting with Finland and ending with Iceland. Each panelist will start with their general thoughts, and once all the panelists have spoken, we'll have some follow-up questions. We start with Maria Annala, who is a Finnish journalist and a visiting researcher at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. She has worked as a journalist in Boston and written a book about Trump supporters. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jay. The point I wanted to start with is that the amount of interest Finnish people have shown the US presidential elections this year has been astonishing. Finnish people generally follow US politics quite closely, but what we've seen this year has been just exceptional. Unlike anything we've seen, at least in my lifetime, which spans around 40 years. And it's been followed more closely, this American election here in Finland, than pretty much any of our national elections, let alone EU elections, which are not generally considered very interesting here in Finland, even though all of those have a much more concrete impact in our daily lives than the American elections. And election night was especially interesting in the sense that Finland is 7 hours ahead of DC. So you'd think that Finnish people would go to bed and wake up in the morning and check the news to see if we have a result, especially since this year we knew that it might take several days or even weeks before we knew who the winner was. But a lot of Finnish people actually stayed up all night or got up at 4 a.m. or something else as ridiculous as that, just to follow the events as they were unfolding. And the Finnish media also had noted that there was a lot of interest because they spent a lot of their scarce resources into these all-night election night specials. Pretty much all the big medias were doing it. Even newspapers had live video for hours and hours on their websites with Finnish experts commenting on the results as they were being counted. And I was one of the Finnish US politics experts who was commenting on the situation, the vote count situation in several of these programs. And in that capacity, I got firsthand experience of just how emotionally invested a lot of Finnish people were in the contest between Trump and Biden. I especially remember this middle-aged mother who commented to me a couple of weeks after the election that the election week was the best week of her adult life. I would have thought maybe her child being born or getting married would have been the highlights of her adult life, but she chose to highlight the US elections. And I also got a lot of messages, both from Trump opponents and Trump supporters, all Finnish people. Messages and by email, social media, and I really could tell that the Trump supporters, they were so passionate, they were so angry, they got very mean and personal, attacking us experts when the results did not seem to be going their way. They wanted us to call it differently. So a lot of emotions there. But even though I got messages from both sides, my impression is that most of the Finnish people who were following the elections closely were doing it first and foremost in the hope of seeing Trump lose. It's not surprising. I mean, educated people are generally the ones who bother to follow a foreign election closely. And Trump has antagonized experts, expertise, journalists, politicians. He has really attacked a lot of people who are educated and who Finnish people can relate to. So it's not surprising that mostly the people who were watching closely were hoping to see Trump lose. But even though I was surprised to see just how many people wanted to watch the election so closely, I maybe shouldn't have been. Because to be honest, us Finns, we've been almost obsessed with news about President Trump ever since he was inaugurated. I know this firsthand as well, because during the 2016 election campaign and the first years of the Trump presidency, I was living in Boston and writing about American politics to Finnish media companies as a freelance journalist. And the day Trump began his work in the White House and signed his first executive orders, that's the day when my business became profitable. The amount of news coverage of American politics in the Finnish media spiked so high, and it hasn't really come down ever since. The level of coverage has not decreased substantially. So in that sense, it makes sense that we've been following this Trump saga, and we wanted to see if it were to end and how it were to end. There's not really, to my knowledge, any research about why Finnish people have been so passionate about Trump one way or the other. Both the supporters and the haters are very, very passionate. But I believe it's for the same reasons as in other countries, the US especially, of course, but other countries as well. Trump appeals to identities, and some people find his message speaks right to them. And then there's the other people with the polarly opposite identities who find his message repulsive. In Finland, we have our own culture wars. There's identity wars. There's been, for example, in 2015, there was a refugee crisis in all of Europe, and suddenly we had a lot more, way more asylum seekers in Finland than we had ever seen before. And that, of course, made us talk about immigration a lot. In 2017, there was a new law in Finland which made same-sex marriage legal everywhere in Finland. And of course, leading up to that, there was a lot of conversation about social conservatives and social liberals expressing their opinions on the question of same-sex marriage and many other questions related to that. And all of this has heightened the tensions between the social conservatives and the social liberals. But our own elections aren't as interesting as a way of expressing one's identity as the American ones are. Our multi-party elections are not so well suited for this kind of expression of identity. The American two-party system with these two candidates, it's almost a fight between good and evil. This very primitive story that appeals to every human. And I believe that is why we've been so obsessively glued to our screens this November, just watching what's going on over there in the US.
Well, thank you, Maria. Very interesting insight. Now I'm going to turn to Ola Larsmo, who is a Swedish writer, critic, and columnist for the newspaper Dagens Nyheter. His most recent book is about Swedes who took part in the United States Civil War. Ola?
Thank you very much. I think there were actually like 3,000 Swedes taking part in the Civil War, but that's another story entirely. The last two books I have written has been historical novels about Swedes who migrated to the States. And of course, during all the research I made, I learned a lot about Swedish and American history that I didn't know before. Though some things were quite obvious, some things I knew from the beginning, like there was 1.4 million Swedes emigrating to the States up to World War I. And what perhaps hasn't been that apparent for Swedes, and I don't think for Americans either, is the fact that very much of the aspects of Swedish society that we are proud of and consider part of a modern society are things that we picked up from the States in many ways. So we have in the Nordic countries and in Sweden, certainly, something called the popular movements that would be quite well-organized parts of society that played a very important role when it came to modernization and democratization of Sweden. And I'm thinking of the free churches, I'm thinking about the temperance movement, about the feminist movement, and of course the labor movement. And all of these movements actually got very strong impulses from the States and from immigrants, people moving back and forth over the Atlantic. So in that way, I would say that, and this is kind of funny, because when you hear conservative Americans talking about Sweden as a socialist state or this and that, we can always say, well, we learned it all from you, didn't we, in the first place? This, I think, the fact that part of Swedish society has taken such a great sort of input and learned so much from the States sometimes makes us tend to think that Sweden and the US are more similar as countries than they actually are. There are differences, of course, as well. And when it comes to the fact that Donald Trump was elected president of the United States, I think that actually shocked Sweden and most Swedes quite a lot, because that was not part of what you could say the modern aspect of Western society that we tend to identify with a lot in Sweden, at least. Of course, as Maria pointed out, there are populist movements in Sweden and other Nordic countries as well. We have in Sweden the party, the Swedish Democrats, that actually grew out of the old Nazi party in a way. And they are the only party in Sweden that actually has come out and said that they support Donald Trump and think he's the best alternative for the US in many ways. I would say that almost all the other parties in Swedish parliament would prefer Biden as president of the United States. So in that aspect, I would say that most Swedes from left to right would identify with that part of American society. And as Maria also pointed out, we followed the election so closely, you could hardly believe it. I mean, we had the American TV channels on almost 24 hours every day just to follow the sort of really nail-biting run-up to the election results. So we followed that very, very closely. But when it comes to the Trump presidency and the effect that it has had on the image of the United States in Sweden, I think we could say that many Swedes has been concerned that it looks like the United States is moving away from Europe and moving away from the kind of society that we identify with and that we in many ways picked up from the more sort of progressive aspects of American society during the 19th century. We have been very surprised by the fact that the Trump administration has related to countries like Russia or North Korea for real sort of in-depth conversations about politics and negotiations, and seems to turn it back to Europe in many ways, actually. So that is something that has been cause for great concerns for many Swedes. It has also been very strange to see, of course, as a Swede, I should be used to this, but we have seen in American politics how Sweden, again, is used as an example of this or that. Trump, on a number of occasions, referred to things going on in Sweden that we absolutely had no idea what he was talking about. And then again, it was very strange to see that when the corona restrictions rolled out of the states, some people on the right-wing side of the political spectrum in the state sort of used suddenly Sweden as a positive example. So that was a weird experience, I can tell you that. And the reporting about the corona sort of strategy here in Sweden has been very, very strange in American media, but we can return to that perhaps. I would say, to sum this up, that the historical connections between the United States and Sweden and other Nordic countries are, as you pointed out, Jay, very deep and very long from an historical perspective. They're not always the kind of connections we think. It's not all about US media or US economics. It's also about ideas, about progress, and what a modern democratic society is and should look like, that we really has taken to our heart, which is the positive and progressive side of the United States. But certain aspects of the Trump administration has been almost impossible to understand. Their policy has been very hard to understand. And I think that comes from the fact that that side of American history and American politics is something that we haven't really picked up. We haven't imported those strands of American society. And when it comes to understanding what's going on there, we're pretty much in the dark. But right now, I would say that the mood in Sweden is quite optimistic. The signals coming from the upcoming Biden administration is pretty much that they will be back on track, not least when it comes to climate issues and environmental issues. And in that way, it feels like the bridge over the Atlantic might actually be patched up again. And I think that's the only way we have of moving forward, actually, especially when it comes to environmental aspects. I could go on about this forever and ever, but I just want to mention that the Nordic Museum in Seattle is actually one very interesting aspect about these very, very deep and strong connections between the Nordic countries and the US and Seattle in particular. So I think that is one of the places where you can see where we picked up a lot of stuff from the States that we are pretty grateful for. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola, for a very interesting presentation. Now I'm going to turn to Norway and to Ivan Reiten. Ivan and I met in Oslo in 1979 when he was head of the youth wing of Norway's Farmers and Fishermen's Party. He later became Norway's deputy finance minister, then minister of fisheries, and then after that, minister of oil and energy. And then he had a business career. First, he had a 10-year run as the CEO of what was then Norway's second largest company, Norsk Hydro. Currently, he is the chairman of the board of several companies, including Kongsberg Gruppen, which is the Norwegian equivalent of Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon, kind of all wrapped together, as well as a Swedish ferry company called Stena Lines. Ivan therefore brings the perspective of a politician, a government official, and a businessman. Ivan?
Well, thank you, Jay. Great to be with you. Let me first of all say that I almost entirely concur with what's been already said from Maria and Ola. But maybe as a starting point, say that there is a TV series in Norway now, which is called Atlantic Crossing, and dwells a lot with the Second World War and the fact that the Norwegian Crown Princess at that time, whilst the cabinet and the king and the Crown Prince remained in London, she moved to the States, helped together by the US president. And the series portray a relationship between the US president and the Norwegian Crown Princess that's quite close, basically suggesting that she had great influence on his decisions, and at the same time painting a picture of the US president being enormously occupied with the sort of the destiny of Norway during the World War. This is by historians called fake news in a way, or fake history. But when I mention it, it is because this is how we in Norway would like to and continue to like to see the relationship between those two, with Norway and the States. So those who have made the series have tried to, I think, more think of what we would like to see than what actually was the fact. Obviously, we had great support from the States, but it goes without saying that this history is a bit out of proportion. Secondly, my point would be talking about the election, and I haven't much to add, that Norwegians are quite pragmatic people. So on the one hand, we were surprised by the election of President Trump, but Norwegians tend to think, okay, they choose to elect him, but when he gets into the office, he comes to his senses and really start to do what a responsible and politicians would do, surrounded by his system and all that kind of things. While the Norwegians are not so surprised why he was elected, but how he behaved after he took office is continued something that we sort of question here. But at the end of the day, I must say that if you speak to an average Norwegian, they would say a lot of strange things have been coming out of the White House, but we believe that underneath that, there is a lot of systems and senses that really make sure that this doesn't become politics at the end of the day. And then bringing me to the business perspective of this, what has actually surprised me and not necessarily only with the US, but actually if you look at the global chart in a way, US is not the only place where we have had a president on the top that has sent out quite provoking or populistic sort of messages and been quite vocal in his in raising sort of potential conflicts and unrest and uncertainty. We have seen that in Brazil. We have seen it to some extent in South Korea at the time. Things were very difficult on the top. I could have mentioned a lot of countries also in Europe. You would think, looking at this sort of quite stressed international global political picture, that this is causing a lot of difficulty for business. But that hasn't been the case. Business has continued to develop very well, I would say. I disregard the COVID thing, that's a different part of it. But actually during these times, business has continued to develop surprisingly well and stable. And the US economy has been quite strong. US companies has developed well during all these sort of political turmoil, which in a way, I'm not saying that politics doesn't have a great bearing on business. I'm just saying that the sort of the main roads for doing business, the free trade agreements, all the arrangement that has been developed actually systematically since the Second World War, they continue to work even on this ocean of a lot of challenging political signals. So that's I think an important aspect to bear in mind, and that's what we are seeing here in Norway also. And those the businesses in Norway doing business with the United States over the last, I would say, not only 4 years but also the last 4 years are doing quite well and are praising the relationship with their colleagues and their customers or what have you, suppliers in the US. I think so all in all, it has been a strange time. We are watching US politics more than ever, but still with a sort of the Norwegian attitude that it will sort out at the end of the day, so it's not as bad as it may look. I think a different aspect here where we are discussing and where we are, and I'm still talking more from the business community than from the political one, is how we deal with these big multinationals where the winner seems to take it all. We have the issue of how we're going to tax them, how we're going to deal with them governance-wise, and quite a few of them is based in the US. So that's more something that is high on the agenda in the sort of the business community in Norway. How is this going to influence a small open economy like the Norwegian economy? Because we are a country where we have the income per capita is, as you mentioned, Jay, very high, and it's a very attractive market to be in, even though it's small in itself. But it's a high buying power per capita. So these multinationals are here every day, and Norway still want to sort of be governing their country and their rules on their own, and therefore we are debating that. I'm not saying that it makes us hostile to the US, but it is part of the total picture. So, but all in all, a situation I would say is roughly colored by the last 4 years, but I would think that Biden coming in now, half a year from now, Norway will talk about US pretty much as before. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan. And that's very interesting. Your comments about the business world. And I'm thinking, sitting here in Seattle with companies based here like Amazon and Microsoft, I think interesting perspective. So now I'm going to turn to Denmark and Greenland, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Nauja Bianco. Nauja is the executive director of the North Atlantic House and Greenlandic House in Odense, Denmark. She's the child of a Greenlandic father and a Danish mother, and she grew up in Greenland and then studied in Denmark and has made a career of working with both in government and in other ways. And with the US connection, she was a high school exchange student in Weaverville, California. So Nauja, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you to the Nordic Museum and the University of Washington Scandinavian Studies for bringing us together, for building these bridges between us and building this transatlantic tie and really trying to facilitate mutual understanding between us. I'm all for that. I'm all fan of that. I just wanted to, again, stress that, my dad was born in a clay hut in Eastern Greenland in 1942. And at that point in time, Greenland was really an isolated island. It was even when I grew up in Greenland. But one way or the other, I became what I term as a global Greenlander, despite of being on an island and being isolated. American popular culture really has meant a lot, even came to Greenland, have Coca-Cola there before the 1990s. But it influenced me a lot, and it brought me to California as a high school student. And that sort of brought me to a career as a diplomat, first and foremost for the Greenlandic government, doing foreign affairs that was related to Greenland, related to the Arctic. I've been posted in Brussels. I've worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, and I've been a special liaison between Denmark and Greenland. And I've lived in Canada and in the US and North America. And then on top of that, I've been working for the Nordic Council of Ministers. So I've really had the privilege to look into the Nordics, if you will. Now I'm going to focus on the relationship between the US and Greenland and the Faroe Islands, because there's really a special relationship with regards to foreign security policy in that area. And what we need to understand to begin with is the special dynamics between the Kingdom of Denmark, so between Denmark, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. So by international law, Denmark is a state, and Greenland and Faroe Islands are entities under the state of Denmark. And that really means that Greenland and Faroe Islands have no competency over foreign security policy. That is really a matter of the state, which in this case is Denmark. Having said that, it's important to stress that Faroe Islands has a home rule agreement, while Greenland has a self-rule agreement. So both countries have autonomy over most areas of society. Now, I'm going to focus a little more on Greenland because that's where I'm from. But it's important to mention that there's a special relation between the US and Greenland that was really underlined during World War II. So when Denmark was taken over by Nazi Germany in 1940, there decision made by the former Danish ambassador to Washington, or to the US at that time. He did not want to acknowledge the takeover of Denmark by Nazi Germany, and said that he was representing the free Danish government. And in doing so, he basically gave all rights over Greenland to the US. That meant the establishment of weather stations in Greenland, U.S. weather stations that were used in warfare, basically. It meant the establishment of U.S. Air Force bases, of which there is still one left at Thule in northern Greenland. And it also meant that the U.S. basically had taken over the protection of Greenland between 1940 and 1945, so during World War II. And it also meant that Greenland supplied the U.S. with cryolite from one of our mines in southern Greenland. So there was an extensive relationship. And we had a prolongation of that relationship ever that the U.S. opened its consulate in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, in the spring. And it seemed like it followed the real estate proposal from President Trump to buy Greenland in 2019, but it was actually a consequence and a result of many years of diplomatic work in terms of establishing a more presence, if you will, of
Yeah, that's fascinating. I know we're going to return to that. That's a very interesting perspective. I think finally we will turn to Iceland. And so I'm going to turn the floor over to Silja Bara Ómarsdóttir, who is the professor of international affairs at the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Iceland. Among her many outside roles beyond her professorship is the fact that she's the chair of Iceland's Gender Equality Council. And I also want to point out that she got her bachelor's degree at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, just a little south of here, and one of her graduate degrees from a university in California. So Silja, look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Jay. Great to be here with you, and thank you for inviting me to be with you on this panel. There's a lot of things that have come out that clearly indicate how much the Nordic countries have in common. I think for many of the Nordic countries, they will claim that they have a special relationship with the US based on a long history, some historical links, migration, and more. For Iceland, we can go back to the early 20th century, late 19th century, when almost a quarter of the Icelandic population moved to the Americas, by and large to North America, to what's today the Dakotas and neighboring regions in Canada. 15,000 people out of 70,000 inhabitants of Iceland actually made that journey. The US was the first country to recognize Iceland as an independent republic in 1944 and maintained a military base here more or less throughout, from that time almost continuously until 2006. Iceland is a founding member of NATO and maintains a bilateral defense agreement with the US, in addition to that being the only unarmed member country. Icelanders have gone to the US for education and training and work. I am myself an example of that. And recent numbers indicate that Icelanders are the highest per capita of any European country in going to US universities. 1.63% of college-aged Icelanders are studying in the United States. The political relationship between the two countries, of course, has not been completely level or completely easy. The military base was a bone of contention throughout the Cold War and during a left-wing government coalition in the early 70s. The threats were made that the US would be expunged from the country because of the Cod Wars, so-called, between Iceland and the UK, where Iceland wanted to get the support of the United States. The closing of the military base then in 2006 was a unilateral agreement, a decision by the United States, and left sore marks among especially the conservatives in Iceland, who felt that they had done a lot to try to support the United States and maintain its presence and project a positive light on its presence in Iceland throughout the Cold War and the years following. However, there's always been this strong cultural pull to the U.S., and that really has not changed very much. Over the last years, Icelanders, I think that in the general population, will have started to see things a little differently. The aura projected from the U.S. that its political institutions are strong and reliable has been shaken, and the belief in the U.S. as a leading democracy has been shaken, with all the issues that have come up, where the public here asks frequently, can he really do that? Because we have picked up through popular culture and our studies in the US a lot of information about how the US political system is supposed to work. Jay mentioned in the introductory remarks that this Pew study that demonstrated the falling respect that the US enjoys around the world. Iceland is not one of the countries sampled in that study, but when it came out, there was a smaller survey conducted here about support for the big party presidential candidates, the Republican and the Democrat. And unsurprisingly, I think this probably holds true for all the other countries. There's far greater support for the Democratic candidate, not as clear as it was in 2008 when Obama was running, or even in 2016 when Clinton ran, where the support was almost 100%. Very, very few people, even on in the far right conservative wing, would have indicated that they would support the Republican nominee rather than the Democratic one. But today we see an 8% support for Trump in the general population, 14% among men, 4% among women. And in the parties that we would consider the more populist base here in Iceland, up to 20% of their voters actually would have supported Trump. And if I can link a little bit back to what Maria was saying at the beginning about, and I think Ola also mentioned this about the political parties in Finland and Sweden, we have parties that are flirting with this populist or demagoguery that Trump has projected and used to polarize political discussions and opinions in not just in the U.S. but around the world. And I think we are going to have to deal with this for a long time to come, even though he has now lost the elections, and we'll see a new president in the U.S. in just 40 or so days. Here in Iceland, there's great enthusiasm for the elections. They are incredibly, Icelanders are incredibly active. There's a big Facebook group which has tens of posts per day where people are talking about the latest polls or the latest turns, the nominations of the Supreme Court justices and so on. These are Icelanders who live in the US and who live here in Iceland and just follow along. I comment on US politics and teach US politics. So I'm in the media a lot, and I just looked at my calendar real quick before we came on the air. And I think I have about 30 media contacts in the last 45 days before the elections and in the wake of it. So there's a lot of coverage, a lot of discussion, and a lot of interest. What I think most people are looking forward to seeing now is whether we will go back to the Obama era policies, which for Iceland, interestingly, again, what Nauja was mentioning, there are There are issues that were during the Obama era that were more problematic in the relationship between Iceland and the US, particularly the pressure on Iceland to abandon whaling altogether, which resulted in limits on high-level visits to Iceland, high-level governmental visits to Iceland, and that has completely changed. In the Trump era, we've had visits by very high-level representatives, including Secretary of State Pompeo, and the sort of indicating that the political interest, geopolitical interest possibly, military interest possibly, in Iceland has increased. And while we, I think that in the political system that was greatly appreciated, the general population certainly did not enjoy the Trump presidency for more than as a spectacle and a cause of sort of an almost everyday scandal. There's a lot of discussion, but mostly in surprise that a country that has had this history of projecting itself as a strong democracy would have institutions that appear to fail when they were or come so close to failing when they are tested by this unusual politician that has been in the White House for so many years. So I think even though we realize that the next administration may make more demands on the Icelandic political system, there was quite a sigh of relief when the results of the election were clear. And people look forward to a more normal relationship and more predictable policies to come from the US in the near future.
Celia, thank you very much. And I think you wrapped up some of the things that I heard during everyone's intervention, including that, so one issue that I thought was very interesting is that it's not 100% of all people who live in the Nordics who question the policies that the current president has. And in fact, there's in Greenland and in the Faroe Islands, they might look at this time as a net positive. But I also heard that as we transition, there's kind of two strands that I heard here. One is that we'll probably go back to, or the people of the Nordics will look at a kind of a return to normalcy. But then there's also the question about, will the people of the Nordics, knowing what they've watched about how our democracy here has functioned, whether there will be kind of enduring questions. But let's go back to each, and I wanted to ask, starting with Maria. I know you were in the press corps when the Finnish president visited the White House in 2017. And I know you asked a question there and it got a lot of attention in Finland. And I think our audience would be very interested in knowing about that.
Sure. So the journalist we're talking about, she's an investigative journalist who has done a lot of work on Russian information warfare online. And she's published a book called Putin's Trolls. And she's been targeted online a lot for that. And that was the reason behind the award. And when the award was, suddenly the invitation was dropped, everybody suspected that the reason was that she has been a vocal critic of President Trump on Twitter. And that was later confirmed to be the reason behind the withdrawal of the award that had already been announced she was going to receive. And I actually asked my Twitter followers about this, whether that impacted their view on the US. And a lot of them said no, that they had already formed an opinion based on all the other news related to President Trump, that this particular incident was insignificant in comparison to a lot of other things Trump has done. But a lot of them also stressed that even though the incident may have impacted their view on President Trump, our views on President Trump are totally different than how we view the U.S. as a whole. So it's important to remember that Finnish people, and I think this applies to all the Nordics, we do understand that not all Americans are supporters of Trump and his policies. And even though many of us are very much objecting to a lot of things he has done to democracy and to American politics, that doesn't mean that our view of the US and all Americans has changed dramatically. We can make a difference between one president and the system. But of course, the larger concern is that even though Trump now lost his bid for re-election, he lost it by a fairly narrow margin. And that leaves the possibility that either him or someone following in his footsteps with a similar kind of identity politics appeal might be elected president after Joe Biden or maybe a couple of presidential terms from now. And that leaves us sort of insecure about how we can view the US moving forward, because we're going to have to brace ourselves that even if things become more like we want them to be now under the Biden presidency, things might go back to the other extreme again once the power changes hands the next time. So that is kind of my main takeaway from that incident.
Well, thank you very much, Maria. Thank you very much, Maria. And let me turn to Ola. You, in your opening remarks, you talked a little bit about climate change in Sweden. And, for in the United States, we saw there was obviously a tiff between President Trump and probably the person in Sweden who's most known for climate change, Greta Thunberg. Yeah. And I wonder if you had any comment on how that was portrayed in Sweden.
Well, you could say that it doesn't really help Mr. Trump's popularity figures in Sweden that he attacked a teenager like that. Actually, my own newspaper, Dagens Nyheter, yesterday they had a special issue where they had invited her to be guest editor of the whole newspaper. So yesterday our whole newspaper was about this one thing, climate change. And I think that shows what an impact these issues have in Sweden, and I would say in the Nordic countries in general. When we're looking at the political and cultural landscape right now, we look toward a time where the pandemic no longer dictates what we can do and how we can travel and so on. But I don't think that very many people think that we can go back to exactly the same type of society we had before this pandemic struck. But on another point, you could say that the whole climate issue shows that we are in this together, and the international structures that I think populist governments all over the world, not just Trump in the States, but as even mentioned, for instance, Bolsonaro and other sort of representatives of different populist movements, they are very hostile to these kind of international agreements and bilateral agreements. And I think that if we should focus on one thing that is extremely important, is that the Biden administration has promised to rebuild these structures. And I think that's almost an issue of life and death for the planet. I'm sorry if I sound dramatic, but I think that's a fact. And I think that might be the most interesting and important result to come out of this election.
Well, thank you, Ola. That certainly, I think your comments reflect a broad, strong, prevailing view across the Nordics on climate change. Ivan, when you presented, you talked a little bit about the way I perceived it was kind of going back to normal in a way with the Biden administration. I guess I'm curious to know your views on knowing that the this current administration has not been considered normal in many senses of the word. Will it be? How willing is our Norwegians going to be to feel comfortable if indeed the Biden administration, as suggested, is going to return to a lot of the processes that were considered normal before this administration?
Well, I think, Jay, that my short answer to this would be that, or my first part of that answer would be that, as I said in my introduction, business and business relations between Norway, I would say Scandinavia, and the Nordics in general with the States have actually developed quite well during the Trump administration. So in a way, as I see it, there is nothing immediate to sort of rectify on the day-to-day commercial relationships. And in a way that demonstrates that underneath the sort of the noise from the top, there has been a lot of senses coming together and making these things work out. And if you then talk to the business community today, there are two sort of views. On the one hand, a certain concern that the Biden administration might introduce some actions in their policy that might actually be negative to the business environment, that being tax and other things that could put a dampening effect on the economic growth in the US business as such. But on the other hand, we believe that a sort of a more normality in the relationship with the rest of the world are taking down the business risk all together in doing business, not only with the US, but actually because US set the tone for so many relations that sort of, if you take the sort of the global perspective from at least from Norwegian businessmen, I think we believe that a more normal situation under Biden will altogether be a better situation for us to work under, simply because the worst poison you can bring to business is uncertainty. So in this case, I think we don't believe that this is going to change in dramatically how we are doing our business, but a more sort of, more able to forecast what's going to be around the next corner. I would also stress that sort of we believe that the Biden administration, like rebuilding some of these agreements, about bilateral agreements with the US, bringing US into the Paris Accord again, is quite important, because it's not a sustainable situation to stay outside this as the world develops. And business will always ask what is going to happen if this is really put really on the hot spot, and that seems to be taken away by Biden. And keep in mind, just my final comments from the Norwegian perspective on this is that we are a small, very small country with an extremely open economy. We do not have any, or almost not any, sort of home market to lean towards when it comes to succeeding in business. Everything we should do, except for selling groceries, means that we have to be able to compete on the international market. So the eyes of the Norwegian businessmen are very, very tuned to and focused on how the sort of the playing field globally will be, and we are dependent upon that being a reasonably level playing field. And we actually think that we are not naive when it comes to Biden's possibility to do miracles here, but we think that on the margin, at least, it will be an improvement, even from a business perspective.
Oh, thank you, Ivan. Nauja, I'm very curious to hear a little bit. You've described very well the perspectives of Greenlanders and people from the Faroe Islands on the last 4 years or so. I'm curious to know how the Danes in Denmark would think about this. I'm curious, especially to know how it was perceived in Denmark when during this debate about when the President Trump was offering to buy Greenland. And I should point out, I guess, that is, while it struck, I think, a lot of people very much as a surprise, the United States has in the past bought territory from Denmark. The U.S. Virgin Islands were bought from Denmark, I think, in 1920. And I understand that there was some discussion in 1946 as well to potentially offer to purchase Greenland. I consider it's quite a bit of a different era today, but so I'm curious what you would say about the Danish population's view in mainland Denmark on this.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. Let me just stress to begin with that even though the Faroe Islands and Greenland have gotten a lot of attention during the Trump presidency, I can also just echo what everybody else has been saying throughout this panel. There was a sigh of relief too when it was noted that Biden had won the election in the U.S. Simply because that we need the predictability of another administration. And that goes for Greenland and Faroe Islands as well, even though they have gotten a lot of attention. So what's important to understand here, and I'll get back to the real estate purchase deal, but what's important to understand here is that Greenland as well as Faroe Islands are using this interest from the US and from the Trump presidency as a lever to work within the Kingdom of Denmark. So as a lever to increase their own autonomy when it comes to foreign security policy as a lever rather than Denmark. So there's a dynamic here between the three countries within the Kingdom of Denmark that's important to understand. What's important also to understand in relation to the U.S. attempt to buy Greenland, or the so-called property purchase deal, is that it's very, very sensitive. Greenland is, as I mentioned, still a part of Denmark, but it's in a nation-building process. Trying to actually remove itself to a larger extent than what has been the case, and getting more that we have today. So again, as a lever, using the US as a lever to distance itself from Denmark. And within that framework, we also need to talk about our colonial heritage. And the notion of somebody else rather than Denmark owning Greenland is a no-go. So that was a lot of objection to the idea. And when President Trump, Prime Minister, was actually in Greenland, having meetings with her Greenlandic counterpart, and what it actually did, it actually brought the two parties together in opposing to this. As Prime Minister, the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, said, this absurd idea. And just a fun fact too in this, and that might be one of the only places in the world that you don't have property rights.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Well, thank you very much for that added context, Nauja. And now to Silja, I'm curious, maybe you have some comment about Iceland, the Icelandic view of the United States from your position as chairing the Gender Council. I wonder if you have any comment on that.
Well, there's great enthusiasm here in Iceland for Vice President-elect Harris. She's become very popular, and surrounding this election, there's been some discussion about how how remarkable it is that it's the year 2020 and this is the first time we see a woman anywhere near the White House in a role other than as a spouse. It's one of the things that my students often notice, and I mean, of course, it's a trait in part of first past the post districts that diversity comes slower than it can in proportional representation. But the lack of women and the lack of people of color in elected offices in the U.S., of course, is striking to anybody who looks at it from the outside, especially considering how the U.S. is one of the most diverse countries in the world when it comes to the population, the composition of the population. We are also have been shocked here in Iceland to follow what has been going on in the court system with regard to the limits of reproductive rights. And there's a big fan club of the late Justice Ginsburg here in Iceland. Women in the law and well, in society, who I had so many people reach out to me and talk to me about where were you when you heard? Did you wake up to the news? Or because they felt like she was a guardian of women's rights and the right of pregnant people in the U.S. So it is quite strange, and I noticed my American colleagues who are working on gender and politics in the U.S. A lot of what they're working on is violence towards women in elected office, with both cyber violence and direct violence. So there's a lot of concern with the situation in the U.S. and hopefully, we're, I think, encouraged, people who are promoting gender equality in our own countries are encouraged to see the increased diversity and the increased prominence of women in the coming administration, and hopeful that this will have an impact in the longer run. But it is an interesting sort of contradiction in terms that the United States, that as I mentioned, portrays itself as a country where people can pull themselves up by the bootstraps, and your talents should be what determines where you are. That the structural impediments to equality in many senses are so difficult to break, even far more difficult than they are in the more social egalitarian Nordic states.
Well, thank you, Silja. I think we have about time for just a very 1 minute or so wrap up, or 2 minute wrap up from each of you. If you would like to say, kind of sum up your thoughts about the attitudes in your respective countries toward the United States. So I'm going to start with Maria.
Thank you. A lot of what the others have said could have also been said about Finland. There was a poll conducted in Finland before this election, and Biden was the favorite candidate of 75% of Finnish people, according to that poll, whereas Trump was the favorite of 10% of Finnish people. And the environmental questions that have been mentioned that Ola talked about, they are very, very relevant also in the minds of the Finnish people, and that is one big thing that we're really hoping this change of power in Washington will bring about, that the US would rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement and become active in the global fight against climate change. Another thing that's very important to us is, as a small country, we really value the international rule-based order that the US used to be a champion of, but has not been under President Trump. And Biden is a known internationalist with close ties to allies and a strong appreciation of allies. And we're really looking forward to the US coming back to the table, not just in the Paris Climate Agreement, but just in general, all the structures where different countries come together and decide about things that impact all of us instead of this America First policy. Because even though Finland's bilateral relationship under President Trump has been quite good, it's really in a small country's interest, and I'm sure this applies to all Nordics. It's in a small country's interest that there's a rule-based order instead of just the biggest and the strongest countries doing what they like and playing with the rest of our fates. So those would be some of the very big aspirations that the Finnish people have and things that explain the sigh of relief. I totally relate to what others were saying about a sigh of relief when Biden was indeed victorious in this battle against Trump.
Well,
And thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Maria. And Ola, concluding thoughts?
Well, as you mentioned at the beginning, I've just finished a book about the American Civil War, and I think that's one of the periods when you could really see the very, very best and the very, very worst of the sort of American politics and American ideas. And writing that book, I really got it underlined how important ideas are. I mean, ideas about democracy. I think a lot about a song by Leonard Cohen called Democracy, actually, when it says a lot of interesting things about democracy and about the United States. And he calls the United States for the cradle of the best and the worst. And I think that's absolutely true in a way. We get the best ideas about democracy from the States, and also some of the worst things recently has been shown. And I think these sides of the United States, the best and the worst sides of the United States, has been very, very visible for us in the Nordic countries during this election. And I'm looking at the election now to the Senate in Georgia, and I think the best and the worst sides of the states are very visible there as well. So we're going to follow that with great interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola. Very interesting. Ivan, concluding thoughts?
Well, my short concluding thought is number one, to remind you all, it has been said already that the United States still has a place in many Norwegian hearts for the reason that we have mentioned, the migration, the support after the World War II and all these things. So my late father, when I discussed European politics with him, he listened to me and he said, Europe is okay for me, but never forget the importance of the states. They helped us after the war, and don't miss the contact with the states. I think that is a certain relief now in many homes in Norway that these things will normalize again. And as I've also said, not only normalizing the bilateral relations, but actually that the world order in a way will be restored with a administration in Washington that will bring US back to at least back to where we think they belong, and where they really are a constructive party to the global, to the development of the global sort of, also the global business playing field, including the environmental concerns that need to be addressed in order to create this stable environment. So all in all, I think we are moving into a territory where we from business doesn't believe that things will change dramatically overnight. As I've said a couple of times, we have actually worked quite well under the current administration, I would say, despite the White House situation, whilst we are now seeing a more sort of stable and hopefully normalized development, which always in the long run is what business needs.
Well, thank you for a very articulate summation, Ivan. Nauja? Nauja, you are on mute right now.
Now I'm on. I think the exceptional interest that we've seen also in Denmark, Greenland, and Faroes with regards to the US election is that it's really a question of democracy. It's an interest for the state of democracy, and it's really the interest that democracy has been at stake and that we need to work together on sort of strengthening the global democracy again. And President Trump has, I would say, detriment to the relationship. It's obviously easier to tear down relationships than building them up. But I think, and I see in Denmark, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands that the transatlantic ties are strong. And there's a willingness to strengthen these transatlantic ties. Administration is at. We need to stress that the Nordic countries aren't socialist countries, or at least not in a sense that that with the socialism that has a negative connotation, which is often seen in the US. I think it's important to stress that these are social liberal democracies with market economies that really want strong transatlantic ties. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nauja. And then finally, Silja, you get to close it up.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's been really great to hear the consensus among the different voices, and especially considering the different backgrounds that we come from. I think what I find most important is that I have faith in the incoming presidency's ability to tackle the pandemic that is raging in the US, and I hope that that will be quick, that the vaccines are as effective as is promised. And secondly, I am very grateful that we have a president-elect in the US who is going to rejoin the Paris Accords to try to combat climate change, because I think, as Ola said, that this is absolutely a matter of survival for not just our countries, but for the world. I think this is extremely important. Somebody also mentioned that, what we're looking forward to in the US is this question of democracy, not just for the US, but the projection of a credible democratic role model around the world. And one of the things that my students have been very infatuated with this semester in US politics is the idea of the Electoral College and the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. I think I'm getting the order of those words right. And to change the system, which disenfranchises so many Americans and undercuts democracy in choosing the most powerful person in the world, that there are so many people whose votes count so little and are simply discouraged from voting. And I think what we're going to follow in the Senate elections in Georgia now is going to be maybe a promise of what kind of developments of democracy in the United States we're going to see over the next 10 years, until the next census, that is, because of course that's going to be really important.
Well, thank you so much, Silja. And right now I would like to thank the audience for joining us. I also want to give a hearty thanks to all of our panelists. You really, I think, did great justice to this question. And I also want to thank an anonymous donor from the National Nordic Museum board who helped make this program possible. So thank you all for joining me, and thank you.